You're watching Drucker TV. My name is Jyoti Guptara, and I'm the author of Business Storytelling from Hype to Hack. In an increasingly competitive and fast-moving business environment, imagine if there were a process that could turn challenges into opportunities for innovation. Enter design thinking, a creative process to better understand your users, challenge assumptions, and create products that make a difference. Ultimately leading, of course, to better products and processes. Joining us now is Tim Brown, co-chair of the global design and innovation firm IDEO, of legendary renown. Tim Brown's best-selling book, Change by Design, has introduced design thinking to millions of business professionals, as have your TED Talks. Welcome back to the forum, Tim. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Now, one of the things that I love about design thinking is how counterintuitive the results can be. It reminds me of the scientific method where someone like Aristotle said that logic is reality, and therefore you don't actually have to go out and observe things. And then centuries later, Francis Bacon and the others came up with the empirical approach to science, which helped create the modern world. Can you share with us how you do that? What is your sort of empirical approach to design?
Well, design, much like the scientific method, is about discovery, and it's about discovering something that's a little bit different, though. I mean, if the scientific method is about discovering a kind of a single truth, like how the world actually is, design is all about discovering possible alternatives, right? Because there can be many, many creative solutions to a particular problem, and the ones that are more surprising and less expected are the ones that we're often searching for. So it's rare that we can go out into the world. We do a lot of going out into the world, but it's rare that we can go and do that and simply ask, please tell me how would you like me to solve the problem? You tell me, and that doesn't work very well. What we're looking for is hints and kind of clues and inspiration that then leads us to some new solution. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not very algorithmic in some ways, but fortunately, that makes it much more interesting.
Can you give us an example of a favorite product or process that you helped to design and how it was counterintuitive?
Well, I think actually just before we got started talking, I think we were showing a talk that I gave last time I was here, and I was talking a little bit about the Innova schools, which are these remarkable schools that got designed for Peru, where we had a chance to reinvent everything about how a school works, including the kind of classroom and the pedagogy and the curriculum. And you'd have sort of assumed that had been pretty much figured out by now, right? That 25 kids with a teacher was the way to do school. And actually, by going out and sort of studying and thinking and looking at alternatives and dealing with some new constraints, like there weren't enough trained teachers in Peru, we actually came up with a solution which was a blend of online learning and in-classroom learning that was far more efficient. The kids did really well. They've blown away the kind of national standards, both for language and mathematics. It's been incredibly successful, but was kind of an approach to structuring or designing a school experience that had never been seen before.
I love it. I'm in storytelling, and just like you with design, you get to see into and behind all sorts of industries. You mentioned constraints beforehand, and something that people are often surprised in my workshops to learn is that constraints can actually help us to be more creative. Can you tell us about the kind of constraints that you may either be forced on you, or that you actually force on some of your clients to help them become more creative?
I mean, design by nature has to have constraints, and in fact, the proverbial blank sheet of paper is the worst place to start. And if we have no other constraints, then we often turn time into a constraint. We have to get something new by a certain time. But no, I mean, constraints are essential because they give you something to push against. They give you. Sometimes you try and break the constraint, right? I mean, if maybe it's well, we have to do something for this kind of cost. Well, if we did something for a bit more, we create maybe multiples in value, maybe that's worth doing. So it just gives you a way of thinking about the problem creatively. So understanding the constraints, understanding how to challenge the constraints is an important part of the design process.
This year's theme at the Drucker Forum is creative resilience, and our website has featured a big quote from you, where you say creativity is essential to resilience. It brings the new and unexpected ideas so necessary in times of disruption. Now, you'll be speaking on a panel tomorrow about which companies bounced back better from the pandemic years. And since our audience can't join us in person in Vienna, would you give us a sneak peek and maybe share with us what kind of organization did bounce back better?
Well, I think it's interesting. So organizations with creative resources in general can respond well to a crisis. And we saw this in the pandemic, right at the early moments of the pandemic, when we saw organizations that had large design organizations like Ford Motor Company or Dyson in the UK switch a lot of those resources to helping solve problems for society, like how do we make PPE or ventilators really quickly because our hospitals don't have enough of them. And my own personal experience was I found myself invited into a whole bunch of those kinds of projects. And it changed my sense of the pandemic, right? From one where I felt like a helpless victim to one where I felt like I actually had some hope because I was involved in sort of solving the problem. But there was a lot of examples of organizations applying their creativity on behalf, if you like, of society. But the other thing I think is very important to think about and to recognize is that a creative mindset doesn't just help organizations be more resilient, it helps individuals be more resilient. And so there's quite a lot of research now that indicates that that organizations who encourage people to have creative mindset have people that are more connected, they're less lonely, they're more optimistic and more curious and more open to new thinking and new ideas. All of that, as you can imagine, helps with resilience. So there's a kind of an individual level as well as an organizational level.
So let's say an organization has not yet been investing in their people in that particular way, they're maybe not innovative. What would you recommend they start doing now so that they can benefit from that holistic virtuous cycle you were talking about?
Well, I think we've had a relatively long period now of a sort of, maybe you call it a movement or whatever, of bringing design thinking into organizations. I think, it's a mistake to thinking about it overly as a method. It's less a method than more of a mindset or a set of mindsets of approaching, being human-centered, learning by making and doing, storytelling, which is a hugely important part of design thinking, and that we can learn those things, right? We may not learn their practice, so we have to literally practice them, and we get better at them. We can't necessarily sit in a classroom, learn them, and then expect to be brilliant. We have to actually go and put them into practice. But there are plenty of examples of organizations that have brought these mindsets, these approaches in, and applied them not only in the department that might do R&D, but also in talent or in supply chain and other parts of or marketing, other parts of the business.
For me, design thinking is one of these concepts or mindsets that has really taken off, let's say, in the last decade. It seems that I've seen design thinking a lot of the organizations that I've been working with. But what you alluded to beforehand does remind me of a conversation I was having with a large organization in Switzerland that had sent thousands of their employees through design training thinking, and they were quite disappointed with the results because it evidently hadn't changed as much as they were hoping, because maybe they didn't know where to apply the design thinking.
Yeah, I think like anything, it's if you take an overly routinized approach to it, then it tends to be incremental, right? So the benefits, they're not necessarily benefits. They may be useful, but they tend to be incremental. If you want breakthrough results, then you need to practice it in a kind of in a deep way, which generally might mean that you need to have people in your organization who've spent a long time being a designer or being involved in design thinking, not just done one or two workshops. And so I think there's still a place in the world for fully trained designers. At least I hope so, because that's what I am.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you can't just tick the box after a two-day training.
You could say the same with science, right? We can all learn the scientific method, and it is useful when we're analyzing a problem in business. Does that make us all into Nobel Prize-winning research scientists? Probably not, right? We still need those. We need those people in our organization, but it's useful to apply the scientific method to a lot of our analysis. So I think the equivalent holds true for design thinking.
Will you and I have a job in a couple of years' time with generative AI? It's pretty good at making art. How good a designer is AI?
It's very good at making derivative art, and it'll be very good at making derivative design. It'll be very good at looking for incremental variations on things we have today. And it may actually be quite good at creating things that we hadn't thought of before. But whether those things will connect to other human beings, I'm less sure of. And I think that is one of the things that design does, right? We don't just make things that functionally work. We make things that other people want. Other people want to engage with, other people want to use. That means you have to make an emotional connection as well as a rational or functional connection. I think that's a deep human skill that it's going to be quite some time before AI knows how to replicate. And so I'm feeling fairly confident that when it comes to you creating stories that are genuinely meaningful for me and get me to think in a totally new way, I think that AI may be able to help you do that, but I don't think it'll replace you. Just in the way that I don't think when it comes to creating designs that really connect with you as a human being and make you kind of want to desire to engage with that thing, I think that AI might help me do that. Maybe it'll help me do it faster, but I don't think it'll replace me.
Let's hope so. No, I'm sure it won't. You're irreplaceable too. Your book, Change by Design, has a chapter dedicated to storytelling. And I remember when I switched from being a novelist to getting into business storytelling, one of the ways that I tried to position my services was design thinking for your message. And I thought that was brilliant, and I was in love with that piece of copywriting on my website. Then I went out and actually talked with potential clients, and I found out some of them still didn't know what design thinking was. So that was, of course, very bad of me from a design thinking point of view. But now I have the expert on the subject. So what do you think of this framing of storytelling as design thinking for your message?
I mean, it's perfectly rational. I mean, you're right. If people don't understand the language, then your story hasn't connected. But no, storytelling. We tend to think of storytelling as something we do after we've done everything else. But for me, storytelling is an integral part of bringing any new idea to life. Right? And whether that's about introducing an idea that you found in the world to somebody who hasn't heard it before, or whether it literally is a new idea that nobody's seen before, and unless you have stories, you don't have any way of expressing that thing, right? As any new idea moves along the journey towards getting out into the world, storytelling becomes more and more and more and more important. And yeah, you can craft that journey, right? You can think about, because I suspect, I mean, you're the expert, not me, but it's not like one story is all you need. You often need multiple stories, different stories at different moments in the journey of an idea. And you need to connect to all the different users and stakeholders you've got in that process. And that's really maybe where the biggest kind of connection to design thinking is if you don't have empathy for your users, if you don't understand who your audience is and how to craft a story that works with that audience, and if you don't know how to surprise them, and if you don't know how to kind of connect to them in their hearts as well as their heads, you're probably not going to be successful. And that's true for what I do as a designer.
You hit the nail on the head. Stories are just as much, if not more, about listening to other people's stories and knowing what your story should include. Which brings me to this idea that leaders in particular, in the past, traditionally leaders have been the people with answers, right? And other people come to them and ask questions and they get the answers. And we've seen a shift increasingly towards leaders helping other people to ask the good questions.
Absolutely.
How can leaders learn to ask better questions themselves or foster curiosity and good asking of questions within their organizations?
I think you've essentially answered the question in the question, which is promoting their own curiosity, right? Spending a little bit more time. I think we've put leaders in a position today where they're hugely reactive. But I think spending more time reflecting, spending more time thinking about the questions of the future, not just the questions of the present. Because in general, organizations are configured around operating the present rather than imagining the future. So if anybody's going to do that, leaders need to do it. I often use the metaphor for leaders, or one form of leadership. There are multiple forms of leadership, but one form of leadership is like being an explorer. You stare at the horizon and ask the question, well, what is over the horizon? Should we go and find out? And so I think as a leader, you need to frame questions that help encourage the organization to head towards the horizon in some kind of meaningful and purposeful way.
There's a big trend towards gamification, playfulness, and creativity. So we all know, in theory, that's a great idea and it appeals to many of us. And yet, if you don't prioritize something like that, it probably isn't going to happen if it hasn't been part of our daily business so far. What practical tips, just as a final quick takeaway, could you give people who would like to benefit from more playfulness and all the associated benefits that come from it?
I mean, playfulness is an essential part of creativity, not in the sense of play because we're kind of bucking off and having fun, but play because it's a way of experimenting with an idea, right? A play of discovery. It's a form of discovery, and it's how we learn as children, right? But it's also how we can learn about new ideas. And you have to use a different form of time, I think, for play. Time that's not machine time that's not scheduled, but instead time that's experiential time. And we've got to force the opportunity. We've got to force time to do that. I mean, one of the reasons that as designers, we structure our time in the form of projects and we immerse ourselves in these projects. We don't do anything else. Is because that's the only way we get to play effectively. And so we've got to move away from asking people to be creative for half an hour a day. That doesn't work very well.
Tim, this was delightful. Thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Tim Brown, legendary designer and design thinking expert. Do check out Change by Design and Tim's other work, and let's all be more intentional about the life and organizations that we're designing.